Good day and welcome to today's StarWind webcast. This webcast is being recorded. And now to begin the program, I'd like to introduce Chris Black. Please go ahead, sir.
Hey, Rochelle, thank you so much, and welcome everybody in our audience to today's webcast, VEEAM Backup and Replication versus StarWind Virtual SAN, Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery, sponsored by StarWind Software. I'm Chris Black with Virtualization Review, and I'll be your host for today's event, so thank you all for joining us for the presentation. We really appreciate that. Just a few quick things before we get started with today's presentation and introduce our speakers. We will have a Q&A session at the end of today's webcast. However, we encourage you at any time during today's presentation to enter your question via the Ask a Question box appearing on the left-hand side of your console. And hopefully, if time permits, we'll get to everybody's questions and get out some answers. Also, today's webcast is being recorded and archived for future viewing and listening purposes. And we'll send you a link to the email you registered with within 24 to 48 hours after today's presentation. Please feel free to share that link with coworkers, colleagues, friends, anybody who may be interested on today's call. We'd greatly appreciate that. And lastly, if you need any resources for today's webcast, they're down there in the dock of your screen in the icon area. You could just click on the resource tab. There may be things associated with today's webcast to further enhance your viewing experience. Without further ado, let me introduce today's moderator for the webcast. His name is George Crump. He is founder of Storage Switzerland and its lead analyst. He's got a wealth of knowledge. I'm sure he's going to be a great presenter today. So thank you for joining us, George. Why don't you take the floor and get us started?
Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate that. So today we're going to just go through a couple of topics on how to really manage recovery time and recovery point objectives in the virtual environment. You know, it's RPO and RTO have been around as certainly as long as I've been in the industry. We talk about it a lot, and how you implement these the math behind these particular terms is really important in not only making sure your organization is successful in the event of a disaster or a server failure or something like that, but also that you're successful in your career. Being able to manage the data protection process is important, and really I believe that RTO and RPO are the kind of the cornerstones of that. Just for background on myself, as Chris had said, I'm the founder and lead analyst at Storage Switzerland. I generally focus on two areas of the market: performance optimization, in other words, how fast can we make things go, and then data protection, how quickly can we get things back up and running. So kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, but they do interoperate at different times. Do a lot of public speaking. You can find white papers on our website, things like that, storageswiss.com. Prior to founding Storage Switzerland, the company actually has been around for 8 years now. Prior to that, I was a CTO at a large storage integrator and helped design a wide variety of different data protection and storage performance solutions. So I bring that sort of expertise into the organization. Just some background on us. As I mentioned, we're an analyst firm. We focus primarily on storage, the cloud, and virtualization, and really how those guys all interact. We gain knowledge of these through a lot of product testing as well as interaction with users like yourselves and, of course, suppliers like we have on the webinar today. And then finally, you can find results of all of that research on our website in a whole variety of different packages, written articles, videos, webinars, product analysis, podcasts, Chalk Talk videos, everything you need is right there. We update it 2 or 3 times a day, so there's always new storage education going on there. And that, again, that site is storageswiss.com. Joining me on the webinar today, for our first guest is Ryan Post. He's from VEEAM. Ryan, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself and VEEAM?
Great, thank you. So yeah, again, my name is Ryan Post. I'm a systems engineer for VEEAM Software. Virtualization has been upcoming, one of my favorite things to dive into. Is why I landed here at VEEAM. Growing every day. I have the VEEAM certified engineer certifications that's out there as well. Currently working on obtaining VCP and a couple other virtualization certifications. But a little bit about VEEAM for anybody who is new to VEEAM. We were founded in 2006. Our global headquarters is in Bar, Switzerland. in North America here, it's in Columbus, Ohio. Also a couple offices here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm located, as well as a brand new office out in Phoenix, Arizona. Couple other things here. We had 58% growth over the past year. We've just went over the 111,500 customers worldwide, 90% of those being VEEAM customers. So, of course, you see some awards listed there. One other statistic, over 5.5 million virtual machines. So a couple of these things here listed, you see what leads us to be the #1 virtual machine backup. And with that, I'll pass it over to Max, their presenter.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. Right, so because I'm the second guest at this event, George is hosting today, and my name is Max Kolomeitsev. I'm StarWind Virtual SAN Product Manager. Earlier, I worked in StarWind on various positions from quality assurance up to both pre-sale and post-sale technical support. And before StarWind actually spun off from Rocket Division Software, which was originally founded back in 2003, I worked at Rocket Division Software at the storage department as well. So this gives us a little information about me. And StarWind itself, as I just mentioned, we spinned off from Rocket Division Software in 2009, got venture capital, and now spinning as a separate company. We've got headquarters in Wakefield, Massachusetts, so we moved from Burlington already. We've got offices in Europe as well, and we are major technology partners with Microsoft, VMware, HP, IBM, Dell, and we're one of the most innovative software-defined storage vendors on the market right now. With that, I think I'll pass everything back to George so he can give us a little intro into the RTO and RPO and how we achieve them.
Hey, thanks a lot, Max. I appreciate that. So let's talk about this. I have this picture here because it is a bit of a tug-of-war between the two terms, and they do impact each other. And so understanding the differences is super important. So let's start with the first one. Recovery point objective is the amount of data that you will lose if you need to restore from, I have backup there, but it could be really, frankly, anything. It's essentially how often are you capturing information and storing it somewhere else so that if something goes wrong, you can recover. And this time frame is really dependent on how important the data is. And it's going to be different for every business. It's going to be different for every application within that business. I was talking to two businesses yesterday. One guy does about 5 transactions a day. They're extremely high-value transactions, but they're only 5. And another one does a whole bunch of small ones, but does almost 10,000 transactions a day. And so for that, either one of those guys, a loss of a server at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is going to have a whole different realm of ramifications. For the guy that's doing 5 transactions, probably not that big of a deal. For the guy that's doing thousands, probably a really big deal, and to have to rekey all that information, it would be a real challenge for them. So that's kind of the core difference. That's really what we're looking at. A recovery point objective is how much information will we lose, and then we're trying to balance that against how important is it that we not lose that information. And there are situations where it just doesn't matter as much. The other one is recovery time objective, and recovery time objective is how long it takes to get the whole thing, if you will, back up and running. The application, reload its data, so recovery point objective is part of that, and that users can access data. So this is from the time I have an outage to the time I have users able to rekey and start accessing the system, how long will that take, right? And so the key point here is the lower, or the term you'll hear us use a lot is the more strict the RPO and the RTO are, generally the more dollars that you're going to have to spend to get there. Now, one of the things we're going to talk about is that the virtual environment in a couple of ways helps us to be more strict with RPO and RTO, at less dollars than it used to cost. And that's some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So if we look at the two terms from how we reduce them, and I kind of gave some hints to this, but recovery point objective essentially is reduced by decreasing the time between what I would call a data protection event. That could be the number of backups you do. It could be the number of times you replicate data to another server. It could be maybe the number of snapshots you do, although snapshots aren't always perfect if the array fails. But it's essentially the number of time between protection events. Recovery time objective, that's really reduced by having very rapid access to a recent copy of data, right? And so typically this is data that is not in a backup format. If I'm looking to reduce the recovery time effort, the time to get it out of my backup format is part of my challenge. The time it takes to move it across a network is part of the challenge, right? So the less movement of data I can have, and the more native of a format that data is in, the better. And so that's really the kind of the key differences between the two of those. If we look at this, a lot of times, I always caution people not to go ask your users, please don't ask your users, how much data can you afford to lose? Because the answer will always be never. It's sort of like asking them, how long can you afford to be down? Because the answer is always going to be 0, right? So you're better off setting the tone or giving the objective and then negotiating backwards from there. But as I said, the recovery point objective is decreased by lowering the time between protection events, and it's typically not achievable by standard backups. A lot of people will resort to snapshots and things like that. And snapshots have their own issues because if they're on a single array and that array fails, you've also lost all your snapshots. Time objective, like I said, the data can't be in a backup format. And there's some sort of inner server linkage here. It could be a cluster, it could be a standby server, it could be a standby VM on another host, it could be another host having access to that data. So there's something like that going on in those environments. And the key thing is that, and one of the things we'll talk about a lot today, is that one of the great things about virtualization, it has extreme value just from a data protection standpoint. Yes, there's great stories to be told about server consolidation and things like that, but its data protection attributes are really quite impressive. The first is how it can help with recovery point objective. So for example, you can do something called change block tracking that allows you to do more frequent backups. Now, you can't go crazy with this. This isn't replication. You can't do 100 a day. But maybe 2 or 3 times a day, you can get a good, clean backup. Because it's change block tracking, the only thing we're changing is just the data, or the only thing we're backing up or transferring is the data that's changed since the last time we did a backup. And we'll talk about that some more. The other is the recovery time objective. The standby server can be virtual, right? So that we don't have to outlay capital. We don't have to have a system sitting idle, right? So that's sort of the next thing there. Excuse me. So let's talk about change block backup. So the way that works, and I've got it kind of drawn out here a little bit, is it basically can move data protection from these huge sequential backup jobs to really small backup jobs, right? And now protection can happen several times a day, and it can be an incremental update. And so if you look in that kind of lower section there, I've got those little kind of grayed out boxes. Those are different versions of the virtual instance, right? And so that allows us to do protection much more often. The challenge is we can't have dozens of these instances. We've got to sort of reconstitute a full backup every so often. And so that process has to happen typically about every third or fourth backup. Ryan might be able to tell you what the VEEAM best practice is, but there's a limit to how far you can go, and you've got to go through this consolidation process. Now the good news is you don't have to do another full backup. The bad news is you do have to do this consolidation. So change block tracking isn't a replacement for straight replication or mirroring or anything like that, but it is a good kind of in-between for servers that, say could afford a 2-hour or 3-hour outage. This is certainly a viable alternative. So let's talk also a little bit about how legacy storage works in this environment and how we can kind of move into software-defined storage in the virtual environment. So in a typical environment that we see today, right, we've got a bunch of virtual machines on top of a bunch of hosts connected to a switch, and then in that switch we've got attached to a disk array. And if you can kind of look on the left side there's the storage intelligence is happening in that array. Well, what you're paying for, among other things, when you buy a standalone array, is you're paying for the intelligence or the software that drives that array. So the snapshots, the replication, the cloning, the thin provisioning, deduplication, compression if it happens to have it, things like that. So all that intelligence is what you're paying for, as well as maybe some architecture design in the hardware. You've probably heard some storage vendors who sell hardware claim to be software vendors, and to the largest extent, they're not stretching the truth there. That's exactly what they are. They're delivering a software solution on top of some hardware. So the challenge is that this infrastructure that we create here does cost money. It costs money to buy that array. It costs money to build the dedicated storage network. And so that creates some challenges as we start to look at addressing RPO and RTO. The advantage in this environment is because all these hosts have access to the same server, we could have a failure and immediately have another server log into that array or log into that virtual machine's instance and bring the application back up and running, right? So that's there's some value there from an availability standpoint, but we've got this cost issue between the investment in the dedicated storage array and the dedicated network. So to change all that, we've started to, you've probably heard a term a lot lately called software-defined storage. And so what we're doing here is you can see I've moved that storage intelligence box into the virtual infrastructure. Right now it can run in a variety of places. It'll depend on the application. Max will probably explain how where their storage intelligence runs. But it goes essentially into the virtual infrastructure. We're leveraging the excess compute in the virtual infrastructure, which most infrastructures have, to drive storage intelligence as well. So instead of buying that dedicated machine like we had here, because that storage intelligence running on that array requires processing power and things like that. And so what we're doing here is we're actually going to leverage the compute capability that's available to us in the virtual infrastructure. Now the next thing though is you can also see that each of these servers I now have installed some internal disk in, right? So we don't have disk out on the network. And then what a lot of this software-defined storage will do is aggregate that pool, those individual drives or multiple drives into a virtual pool of storage, right? So now once again I've created this shared pool that every server can get to, so that if a virtual machine dies on me, I can bring it up on another host and access that data with little to no problem. Now there's some data protection things we probably want to do there, but essentially this gives me really good access to that data. So the difference here is on this slide, if I had a virtual machine fail and it was attached to the server on the far left, I couldn't get to the data from the center server or the server on the far right because these drives weren't shared. Well, because software-defined storage creates some way to aggregate or virtualize that storage, it allows me now to see a shared pool even though the drives are essentially internal to the servers. So what's good about this is software-defined storage can also help drive down RPO and RTO. We talked about in the backup world how with change block tracking we can do this better. Now in the virtual world we can do this. In the software-defined world we can do that as well. So the recovery point objective, we can use various forms of data protection, either mirroring or replication, so that virtual machines are available on on any of the system. We can also, the recovery can happen directly from the production storage. We don't need any transfer, and it's at full performance. We're not coming from a secondary device or anything like that. So, and once again, as I said before, we still take the advantage of a standby server requiring no capital outlay because it's virtual, right? So the value here is that I've got some level of aggregated storage solution via a variety of different attempts, and then all the hosts can get to all the virtual machines' data, so that if there's a drive failure or a server failure, I can near instantly, not zero, but near instantly or very quickly switch over. Now, you're not going to apply this to every single application in your environment, but you will apply it to the ones that make the most sense. And so you'll use a tiered approach that we always talk about in our workshops, where you use you categorize your application. You say, okay, this group here needs to be up very, very quickly. This group needs to be up in a smaller amount of time, and that's where we kind of get into the balance requirement of the two solutions, backup and software-defined storage. So a key thing, obviously, to understand is all servers or applications aren't created equal, right? So you want to apply the right level of protection for the right server, and you don't need to provide instant protection for every single server. You also need to provide protection from two instances, right? You've got sort of a local corruption issue, and then you need protection from a site disaster type of situation. So from a local corruption standpoint, you're going to need to have a second copy stored on a separate set of disks, or somehow independent. And then from a site disaster, you're going to need to have that data physically in another location. So if you look at why we have folks like StarWind and Veeam on the call today, it's as I said before, you can't really hit all your RPO and RTO objectives with a single solution. It generally takes a team effort. And backup products like Veeam really have to always exist. You need that sort of segregated, not real-time copy of data, so that if there's a corruption or maybe even a virus or something like that, you have an isolated copy that's not going to be infected or corrupted. And that's really the role of those solutions, as well as to provide just standard and meet standard uptime requirements for applications that don't need minutes of RTO and RPO, right? If it's longer than that, certainly products like Veeam can provide a full range of capabilities. I know Ryan will go through some of those things that they do to address that. And then for the applications that really do justify and require strict RTOs and RPOs, so narrow windows of recovery, narrow windows of data loss, the advanced storage software solutions like StarWind really give you the ability to increase that uptime and meet those strict requirements, because now we're dealing with a live access to data available from a variety of hosts, so that if a host or a virtual machine has an issue, I can get to it from another system. So that's really the key. And so what we always recommend for people is to group your applications, identify first the applications that really truly need this very, very strict RTO and RPO. Use advanced software, storage software like a StarWind in those. Then universally apply backup, so all your virtual machines should be protected. And then use the backup software capability to meet those levels of RPO and RTO. And backup software could continue to get better. Veeam, for example, has the ability to present a virtual machine directly from its backups. That narrows that window down even further. So you have a variety of solutions, and you want to use as many as you can so you can hit all the different objectives at the right price point. So that hopefully gives you some ideas on how to meet and calculate these different RTO and RPO requirements. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now to talk a little bit about Veeam and how they kind of plug into this whole process.
Thank you, George. Yeah, so starting off here, a little bit about Veeam, where we sit as far as a product, and the biggest point to make is that we are built for virtualization. Right? That's been our focus since day one. So we have great new features coming out each and every release, customer requested features, to keep our customers happy. One of the biggest things that you'll see, especially compared to other solutions out there, specifically legacy solutions, is that we are completely agentless. Right? So there's no requirement to purchase, deploy, manage agents in order to back up or replicate virtual machines. So with that, we're leveraging the APIs available to us from the hypervisor. Whether it's VMware, whether it's Hyper-V, leveraging their APIs to get the guest OS, the virtual hardware, all the objects associated with that virtual machine wrapped up at that image level. Right? And as far as our architecture is concerned, we are scalable. Right? So just kind of a couple key points about the architecture. Right in the middle, you'll see there the VEEAM Backup Server. Right? Yeah, that is the brains of the operation. So it installs on a 64-bit OS of Windows. You have some redundancy and load balancing happen there. That can even be virtual and it can be physical. It does not matter to us. But the way we scale are the components in the middle, the backup proxy servers. Multiple proxy servers allow for parallel processing, redundancy, load balancing. Speaking of recovery point objectives, more proxies you have, the more work that can be done, the more restore points that can achieve throughout the day, depending on your schedule. And then we save all of our backups to a backup repository, and that could be any disk type storage that you have. So we're storage agnostic. From our standpoint, it could be a NAS device, a dedupe appliance, a physical server that has local or direct attached storage. Right? Obviously, the disk types, all that can play into performance. Right? But we are storage agnostic. But we're 2-in-1. Right? So we talked about backups going to that backup repository. At the top of the screen there, we have our replication component. So being able to take a virtual machine directly from a host, again at that image level, and replicate it directly to that DR state you may have. Now, also could happen on-site for some sort of high availability there as well. A lot of users definitely use that, especially without any sort of shared storage in their infrastructure. But what we're able to do with that replica virtual machine is we can keep up to 28 restore points. You're able to have that one-to-one copy so you can power it on with our failover process, including re-IP functionality, including network mapping, just to make processes faster when you have a disaster. But then when you're ready to get back to production, that's resolved. Hey, let's go ahead and fail back that data to the production virtual machine. So with that, how is, at Veeam standpoint, improving RTO? Well, George briefly mentioned it there. One of our technologies that we have is instant VM recovery. And what that falls under is a patented technology from Veeam called vPower. And vPower gives us that ability to run backups directly from that dedupe compressed state from our backup storage. Right? So it gets you up and running in a couple minutes. Now, from my standpoint, I like to compare that to a spare tire in your car. Obviously, you can't go as fast, you can't go as far on that spare tire. Unless you're here in Atlanta where I am, you have people going 90 down the highway with the donut on. Right? I'm guilty of that as well. However, we want to get this back to production and leveraging tools like storage vMotion from a VMware standpoint, live migration from Hyper-V. We can move those VMs as they're running from our backup storage right into production, whatever storage you want to use there. We touched on replication, right? Especially in a disaster. We can replicate at a continuous level. Now, it is near continuous. It's not as soon as a change is made, it's going to be sent over to the DR site. It's going to be based on the schedule that you set. What's going to fit your needs? A lot of times we're seeing tier 1 virtual machines maybe at that continuous option. Right? If everything was perfect, you could have a replica updated with the latest restore point, which is just kept as a snapshot, I'd say within every 5 minutes, right? Things that play into that. Back to the architecture, the proxies, right? How much resources are available to process work. The bandwidth, I would say, is probably the largest component of that, right? And then also change data, right? How much change data has gone from the previous job run to the next, right? And a lot of times it's not about the virtual machine also, right? Instant VM recovery replication really is there to get the virtual machine up running. But what about that recovery time objective for the chief financial officer's budget, or a special spreadsheet that he has, or maybe he's just missing something, right? We need to get that back as well. A couple different options. If you know exactly what day he needs it from, we can jump on in and get it very quickly. However, a lot of times users don't really have that exact day, that exact time they need the file from, and it's all dependent on your retention as well. But we do have a web interface called VEEAM Backup Enterprise Manager. Allows you to quickly browse and search across multiple restore points. So quickly finding you need multiple versions of a file or the exact one that you need to get it back for a user as quickly as possible. Now, RPO, right? A couple different ways achieving that. One, mentioned earlier was change block tracking as one of our abilities there. And someone could press next on the slide. There, it's caught up there.
Yeah, sure. I just did it for you there, Ryan. Sorry about that.
Nope. So one way of improving is change block tracking, as George mentioned earlier. With VMware, they have their own process for that. You've probably seen it if you have used Veeam before or used another product that has enabled change block tracking. It's a .ctk file residing within the VM folders. All right. Now, from our standpoint, that's something that Hyper-V did not have. Our developers actually implemented our own change block tracking engine into the Hyper-V infrastructure, so that is something that we will deploy when we run a backup job for the first time or replication job. It actually has the Microsoft stamp of approval, so it is a Microsoft certified component of our backup product that allows for us to leverage change block tracking. Now, recovery point WAN acceleration. Right, that's something that we have implemented to help get restore points that you've created off the other location efficiently. WAN acceleration is something that is going to be transferring over in our newer version coming out here in Q4. That's going to allow for replication to get more restore points and have a more efficiency with that. And then the last option here is direct SAN access. Right, direct SAN access is our ability to gather data from a production environment a lot faster. And we can give our proxies of physical machine access to an iSCSI fabric, fiber channel fabric, to see the LUNs from VMware. From a Hyper-V standpoint, have access to the clustered shared volumes. Again, a little bit architectural difference there. But we can use that ability to pull the data a lot faster to the proxy, process it, giving you faster backup times, meaning more store points throughout the day. And can someone hit next for me, please?
Sure, Ryan. You know what? I think you might have stuttered for a second. I'll push the slides. Just let me know when you need them out there for you. I'll push them for you, Ryan.
Sounds good. Thank you. So a couple other points on Veeam. It is great. Improving your recovery point objective, recovery time objective, right? But there's a lot of other great stuff that we give out there, and one's application recovery. So we have a lot of granular capabilities that support applications like SQL, Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, really any other application we're able to restore from. And whatever store points you have available, again, coming how often you're on that job, is what we're going to be able to restore from. Whether it's that daily, whether it's the every couple hours, getting down to 30 minutes, or, again, that continuous option. We're going to go into these applications, have that ability to restore from. All right, so from an email perspective, probably is our most popular restore is we can get the entire mailbox from a 2010, 2013 Exchange server backup with our Veeam Explorer for Exchange. We have a Veeam Explorer for Exchange for SharePoint, both 2010 and 2013 supported. But we can get a mailbox. We can go grab a container like the inbox, the deleted items, notes, the tasks with that. We also can leverage our vPower technology, so that ability to run backups from the deep to compressed state for an on-demand sandbox. So an area that you're able to go in, you can just go ahead and run a domain controller with what other VMs, and you can test Windows updates and patches, upgrades. Older versions, say, of Exchange, we have some UAR wizards that will allow for comparison to do restores, from Exchange 2007, 2003. And then really, one other point to make, and I've already brought it up, is version 8. That is something, if you're a current customer of VEEAM, want to look at some of the new features, you can look at our website. But here in Q4, a lot of great features, WAN acceleration making its way for replication, to really help and reduce impact on your production environment. A great thing that we released and announced about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago is I/O control. Limiting how we're going to impact your production storage when we read data, be able to throttle it down to a certain speed once latency hits a certain speed. So a lot of great features coming out on our website. You can find the whole list of features there. But really, to go more of that software-defined storage, we'll pass it over to Max and let him present on recovery point objective and RTO for that.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Appreciate that. Right. So as Ryan already mentioned, and George did as well, so having a backup solution is essential. And really, to have RPO and RTO, you have to maintain a backup. Otherwise, your RTO means how long will it take to buy new servers, and your RPO means how long will it take to ship new servers. And we're not even talking about rekeying all the data. So what StarWind does in this equation, we jump in where applications really demand minimal or really no downtime, and the RTO and RPO are really, really strict. So imagine things like selling Super Bowl tickets. I mean, losing 1 minute of your database activity in this case could be, that could be well worth $250,000. And this is the type of applications we're working with, and here is what we do. So the idea of StarWind Virtual SAN is to use existing servers you may be already using for virtualization and make them fault tolerant from the storage perspective. So main ideas are to have zero hardware footprint, so just use what you have and maybe add additional hardware components to it, let's say more drives to have more performance, or additional networking to have the storage backbone. And another good thing about StarWind is that we try to keep it really simple so virtualization admins can work with it. So with software-defined storage, there is no special certification necessary, and you can really manage it as a basic Windows application or as a web interface, just like that. Now, so what do we do when RPO and RTO are really strict? Let's see if pushing slides the audience works on my end. Yeah, looks like it's working properly. So with the backup, you do have a copy of your data somewhere, and you can always get back to that copy of your data. And as Ryan mentioned, these copies can be really frequent, but at the end of the day, frequency, which we need with strict RTO and RPO, is every point in time. So there should be some sort of a magic TARDIS to get you the latest copy of the data possible, and this is where StarWind comes in. So we can figure a live copy of the production data. It is actually a second instance of the production data which is also accessed all the time. So essentially your virtualization environment or your applications work with multiple copies of the data simultaneously. So you do write your data and you only get an acknowledgement for that write as successful when it is written to all the servers where it's mirrored. Now, this gives us the second bullet point here. We make the infrastructure redundant. We keep at least 2 copies of our data. So this means we have at least 2 servers in our infrastructure. When these 2 servers are keeping a live copy, they can also act as our active hypervisor cluster members. These hypervisor cluster nodes can have their failover techniques, let's say something like VMware fault tolerance or Hyper-V live migration techniques. So they're not really equal, so it's not an apples to apples comparison here, but you know what I mean? We need to have the redundancy and fault tolerance, not only on the storage level, but the applications which you care about also need to be aware of the failover. So say if you want to have your database be available all the time, you configure a guest cluster for the database or use proprietary database clustering tools to protect it from sudden outages. So this way you don't really restart your database virtual machine on the host where it fails over to, but it continues working on that host. So that is quite essential part. So we don't only achieve redundancy on the lower levels. We have to, something John Nicholson said about HA. So HA is not something you buy, it is something you do. So we really have to maintain it throughout the whole process. We configure HA storage access, we configure fault-tolerant virtual machines, we configure a hypervisor cluster. And only this way we can achieve really minimal or no recovery point objective. So it can be essentially 0, because if a virtual machine is fault-tolerant, your primary server fails and the virtual machine continues working on the second host. So I've got you to the basic idea of prerequisites for achieving really minimal RTO and RPO, and I'd like to switch the slide to show how StarWind actually does everything we talk about and how we achieve that level of availability. So on this diagram, we have 2 commodity servers which are running a hypervisor and StarWind Virtual SAN. They're also running some virtual machines, and obviously these 2 hosts are in a hypervisor cluster. It can be Microsoft Favorable cluster, it can be vSphere cluster, it can be Zen cluster. So StarWind in this configuration takes exclusive access to the local storage, then mirrors it using standard Ethernet cards, and then presents it back to the hypervisor cluster as a single virtual disk resource. And at that point, hypervisor thinks that, okay, this is a good storage to have my virtual machines on, and all the virtual machines you see from virtual machine 1 to virtual machine Z are stored on that virtual disk. So the hypervisor thinks that it is a shared storage, it's one drive, I'm fine with that, I store my virtual machines on there, but the reality of it is that each hypervisor node simply stores the virtual machines locally, and StarWind does all the magic behind the scenes, mirroring every block you write to that storage. And George already mentioned that having a redundant configuration like that can impact performance. However, with multiple nodes, we're safe doing a distributed write-back cache. So we not only keep the storage state coherent, we can also keep the cache state coherent. And instead of committing everything to disk, we commit all the writes to memory. And we get that write acknowledgement much faster than we would with just spindles or even all flash arrays. So we're talking about nearly no performance degradation. It can operate at about 90% of the raw storage performance and still have at least 1 copy of redundant data in the configuration. And this config on the screen is the minimal HA configuration. So it can be a VMware 2-node fully fault-tolerant, it can be a Hyper-V 2-node fully fault-tolerant cluster, and then should you require more capacity or more compute power for that cluster, you can easily add a third node, a fourth node, a fifth node, and we can go beyond 64 nodes with this type of setup. And StarWind will merge the local storage between the hosts and provide highly available access to your data. And should any of these hosts fail, you always have a live copy of your data. So as soon as something happens, or if something happens, you don't really worry about RTO and RPO because you know that your recovery time objective in worst case scenario is equal to the time of virtual machine restart, and your recovery point objective is either 0 or it's under 1 minute. So essentially the time it needs to restart that virtual machine on a failover host. And after that, you don't really need to worry about the performance of that virtual machine because since we keep all data coherent, we keep the cache coherent. So as soon as the virtual machine starts, it can access the cache it had on the previous owner node and easily load up the entire database, the entire mailbox, or whatever it was on the virtual machine, and simply continue running and get you back to service as fast as it can. So with that, I would probably wrap up my part of the presentation and switch everything over to George.
Yeah, I'll actually come on, Max. It's Chris. I'll actually come back on and read the questions from the audience today because a couple of questions are actually for George, so I'll come on and ask them to him. But yeah, thank you, Max, Ryan, George. Thank you guys so much for your presentation today. Really much appreciated. So for those of you in the audience, if you have a question for either of the gentlemen that presented today, please feel free to enter your question at this time. We'd greatly appreciate that. So for those of you in the audience that asked your questions already, thank you so much. Our first question here is for George, and this person, James, he's asking, if you use multiple incremental backups for a full backup, will that take longer for a full restore?
Yes. Well, only because you have to do some consolidation work on the back end. Anytime you're going to have to transfer data across the network, that's going to be an impact. In many cases, the big debate over incremental backups and full backups was really more when we lived in a tape-generated world and we had to mount for tape. We had to wait for tape mounts and things like that. Now, we don't really have to wait for that. So with a disk-based system, that timing is not as important as it used to be. There's clearly some consolidation work, but products, again, like Veeam do a good job with that. So there's a balance. I think that you want to kind of use a mixture of change block tracking and do your consolidation jobs on a regular basis. But as far as if you actually have to restore across the network, the impact of a few incrementals and a full is not as significant as it used to be.
We've got a question here for Ryan. This comes from James, same James in the audience. He's asking you, how is the agentless versus agent-based compare on speed? What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Yeah, I would say it's going to be a bit faster, right? Leveraging the APIs, and there's a lot of things that play into it. I mentioned direct SAN access. When we can leverage that, we're going to be pulling on the speed of your iSCSI, your FiberShell fabric, and we're going to stay off your backend network, right? So anything that the users are consuming to access VMs, all that's not going to be affected. And the other component when you think of performance-wise is with an agent-based solution, you're really going to be leveraging the resources of the VM itself, right? So there goes CPU, there goes RAM in order for it to work, for it to gather the data at that file-based, agent-based access. So using the snapshot, using the capabilities with the agentless base, again, we're not going to affect the users. The performance is going to be better using our scaled-out proxy architecture as well to really improve performance, optimize your environment, scaling out. So it's beneficial, and we have if some of you are interested in seeing how it's going to fit in your environment, we have that trial, but every environment is different. So, and we have ways to optimize and help you out with it as well.
Thanks. And another question for you here, Ryan, came from an audience member. His name is Christopher. He says, you mentioned Exchange in your presentation. What about SQL Server database restoration?
Definitely. So there's a couple ways of doing it now. Like I mentioned, we are on version 7. Currently, version 8 is on the horizon here with Q4 starting tomorrow. So who knows when it's going to be released some point Q4. In version 7, we have that on-demand sandbox functionality. We can actually boot up a SQL server in there. We can go in and grab a table, a schema, a query result, comparing what's in that virtual lab versus what's in production, and grabbing those items. Now, from a DBA perspective, you do have the ability to use a third-party tool like SQL Server Management Studio, and we have some connections in that you can make to that database in the virtual lab and script out, query all you'd like the data out. And then just from a database perspective, we can go grab an MDF, LDF, just as a file level recovery, and you can go mount that to maybe a development SQL server you may have to assist with restores. One of the new requests that we put into version 8 was a SQL Explorer. So really, once version 8 released, the virtual lab component to do restores is going to be bypassed, where we can go directly into our backup like we could do with Exchange Now 2010, 2013, just mount the SQL database, do some point-in-time restores as well.
All right, thanks, Ryan. So we've got a question here. Thanks. We got a question here. This one comes for Max. And Max, this question is asking, this comes from Russell, what is the bandwidth footprint for connecting remote sites?
Okay, so for StarWind remote sites, we have at least 2 megabits bandwidth requirement, but obviously the faster the better, and this will also shrink your backup window. And on top of that, we are also testing StarWind right now with third-party utilities which compress and deduplicate traffic between the sites. So I think 2 megabits is a fair number, and I'd say that a reasonable number to start pushing a lot of virtual machines through would be 10 megs between the sites.
Question here for you. This one is asking, VEEAM Virtual SAN needs 3 servers. Is it correct that StarWind needs just 2 for high availability?
Indeed. So VMware Virtual SAN is oriented for 3 servers minimum, and this is their minimal hardware setup. And StarWind Virtual SAN maintains a little different model. So we do not have a quorum model. We do rely on networking between the servers. So this allows us to go with minimal hardware footprint possible and just use 2 vSphere servers to create a highly available cluster.
I got a question here for you, Max. This question is, can StarWind be installed on a Hyper-V server without full GUI Windows server?
Indeed. StarWind can be installed on any Windows version. It can be a Microsoft 2012 R2 Hyper-V, which is the free Windows with just failover clustering and Hyper-V options. And we can also install on the core versions. In this case, you just launch the installation file, and it will give you the standard wizard even if you don't have the GUI enabled in the operating system. And once you have that installed, you simply manage your StarWind installation from your laptop, and you install StarWind Management Console on your laptop, and you manage the entire infrastructure from there.
Thank you so much, Max. Appreciate you answering the question. We've got one question here from the audience member, but this one's directed towards Ryan. This person's asking, does Veeam provide crash-consistent backups guaranteed to be free of incomplete I/O or data corruption for databases?
So yeah, I mean, from the standpoint of databases, there's a couple ways that we can leverage, and crash consistency is going to happen basically with any job run, right? To where the VM is going to power on. Now, when you look at those databases, obviously we don't want to have half-written transactions. So from a Microsoft perspective, for SQL, new versions of Oracle, I believe some other databases that have BSS writers, those are probably the 2 most popular. They have BSS writers, and the Microsoft-approved way for quiescing those databases is calling on their BSS writer. So that's what we actually do before we take a snapshot through the hypervisors. We will quiesce those applications to get transactional consistency. But as far as crash consistent, the VM will be crash consistent. There just may be those half-written transactions. Now, just to mention briefly, I mean, as far as an Oracle running on Linux or MySQL, you can leverage pre-freeze, post-thaw scripts, through VMware. There's ways to do it within Hyper-V as well to make sure before we take that snapshot that we can get that transactional consistency as well. But again, without the transactional consistency, whether it's through pre-freeze, post-thaw scripts or through leveraging Microsoft VSS, you are going to get a crash-consistent backup.
I got a question here. This one's for George. George, so let's try to make this complete for this person, a little bit neat and iron it out. When should I use Veeam, and when should I use StarWind, in your opinion?
Well, that's a really good question, because there is some overlap, and as there always is in technology, right? And so I think at a bare minimum, I would look at a product like Veeam as my foundational, this is what I'm going to build my house on type of protection, right? And then from there's some things that Veeam can do that so let's say my foundation is I can recover everything, worst case, tomorrow. And I know that sounds very uncool in the modern era, but trust me, if you could get everything back up and running tomorrow after your building got washed away in a flood the day before, you'd be a hero, right? So think of Veeam as that sort of that foundational component. Now, if we start to ratchet it up a little bit and say, okay, tomorrow that sounds okay if my building gets flooded, but what if I lose a server, or what if I have a database corruption? Now you're starting to turn the screwdriver a little tighter, and so now we may be talking hours, maybe a half hour, we may be talking minutes, right? As you get into the single-digit hours capabilities that Veeam brings, like change block tracking and recovery in place, things like that gets you into those ranges, right? Then when we start to get into the double-digit and single-digit minute type of stuff, that's when you start looking at some of the capabilities that Max was talking about from a StarWind perspective, right? And so each of those has value, and you don't want to apply it blanket, well, except for the foundation part. You don't want to apply that blanket across the entire environment. You want to look at your applications, understand what they need, and apply the right level of protection to each one, because that allows you to maximize both the cost investment that you're going to make, as well as just helps you manage the environment properly.
Thanks, George. And one last question. We'll direct this one towards Max before we close out the webcast for today. This comes from Carl. He's asking, what distinguishes your storage hypervisor solution from fiber or LAN hypervisor solutions?
Okay, so I guess the main difference between us and other solutions, so if we compare ourselves to the software-defined storage for Hyper-V, I would say it will be correct to say that StarWind was the first company to release a virtual SAN for Hyper-V, and so far we pioneered that market. So it's the software which doesn't work inside a virtual machine on Hyper-V but sits in the parent partition, so it has no virtual machine overhead. Now with vSphere, I guess the selling point is a bit shifted. So VMware Virtual SAN dominates the market, but StarWind is a really good fit for environments where customer doesn't have 3 vSphere servers available. So they can use 2 servers and still leverage HA capabilities of those using StarWind Virtual SAN. So these would be the main differences from other solutions. And I can certainly get into more details, but I guess that we're right at the top of the hour, and I would better dedicate that to a separate event. By the way, I'm doing a StarWind breakout session tomorrow, and you can definitely join that webinar, and I'll get in depth of why StarWind is better for particular scenarios and what would be the best scenario to deploy it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Max and Ryan and George. Thank you all for your time today. I really, really appreciate it, and thank you for giving some great presentations for the audience. I think the 4 of us would like to thank everybody who attended today's webcast for giving us an hour of your time. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to do so. But today's webcast, VEEAM Backup and Replication versus StarWind Virtual SAN, Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery, has been sponsored by StarWind Software, brought to you by Redmond Magazine and redmondmag.com. But thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. We really appreciate it, and have a great day, everybody. Take care.